The fire crackled low beneath a sky, smeared with ice cloud and fading starlight. In a clearing encircled by skeletal pines and vast silence, a lone figure crouched, breath pluming like mist into the freezing air. Shadows danced upon his skin, thin and slick with sweat, despite the cold, as if the weight of something unseen pressed down from every direction. Around him, the land stretched raw and endless, untamed since the dawn of time. No cities, no tools, no names, only instinct, silence, and the ache of survival. But beneath that silence, buried beneath ice and time, something stirred, something not quite alive, yet not entirely gone. It clung to warmth, rode air, slipped between coughs and cries. It did not rage like a beast, nor howl like the wind, but it would come to threaten all breath and all flame. Before man could rise, he would almost vanish. And so it begins the story of the disease that nearly ended humanity before it even began. The world then was a cradle of ice and hunger, a vast and brutal mystery veiled in snow and breathless silence. Southward stretched the hard skin of frozen earth. Northward the blue-white glint of glacial teeth, looming tall as mountains. Herds roamed in shadows, mammoths trudging through deep drifts, their eyes ancient and wary. Saber-toothed cats stitched the ridgelines, ghosts with muscles coiled like traps. And between them, beneath furs scraped thin and bones worn smooth by travel, walked the early humans. They were not yet many, and not yet strong. Their fires flickered in shallow caves and under leaning stone, and their stories were whispered in grunts and sharp hands, passed from mouth to ear over steaming marrow and bitter roots. Two bloodlines drifted across this primal world, one sinewed and enduring, born in Africa's fire, the other broader, colder-blooded, shaped by ice and dusk. They did not know each other yet, but the winds shifted, and soon they would. It began as a subtle thing, scarcely noticeable amid the coughs of wood smoke and the shivers of long nights. A throat, dry beyond thirst, eyes clouded with a strange film, a fever that came not from exertion, but something alien smoldering quietly beneath the skin. The afflicted would stumble from the fire's edge, seeking cool earth, muttering sounds even their kin could not decipher. Their strength melted rapidly, flesh pulling taut over bone, and the light behind their eyes dulled to something hollow, unreachable. Black crust formed where breath once flowed warm, and as they fell, it was as if something unseen exhaled with them. No wound marked the body, yet something within unraveled swiftly, mercilessly. Around them, the tribe whispered in dread, clutching charms woven from bone and ash, but none had words for this invisible killer. They buried the fallen under cairns of stone, but by the next moon, another had begun to cough. At first, they blamed the cold, the damp caves, the smoke curling black from green wood. Then they blamed spirits, the angry ones, left restless beneath the tundra or cast out from burning skies. But as the sickness spread, leaping unseen from breath to breath, doubt began to tremble at the edge of every campfire. Entire shelters were abandoned, their hearths still smoldering, dusted in frost and silence. The old were the first to vanish, then the young, those whose lungs had not yet learned to endure the wild air. Hunters returned thinner, their kills untouched, afraid to feed their families what they had breathed upon. Some spoke of a taint in the snow, a cursed fog that moved with thought, drifting low between the dead trees. Silent, invisible, relentless, the sickness claimed without claws or teeth. And in its passage it left more than death. It left fear. It changed how they looked at one another, how they moved through the world, as if some boundary between man and world had been breached forever. Far to the east, where frost-laced branches groaned under the weight of ice and rivers ran sluggish with slush and blood, two clans approached the same ravine. One came from the high steppes, faces wind-burnt and wary, with snares wrapped in sinew, and memories of flaming grassland behind them. The other emerged from the cold forests, their pelts dulled with soot, bones of fish and birds strung at their necks like talismans. Neither knew the other yet, but their paths converged not by war or peace, but by desperation. Game had thinned in the low valleys, and the winds carried more than just the scent of prey. Carried too in that air was a breathlessness, a hitch behind the ribcage, and a weight settled invisibly upon the strongest among them. As their foragers descended into the same grove, eyes met across frost-hardened brush, not in greeting nor in threat, but in recognition that they had all begun to cough. They did not speak the same tongue, but death, it seems, needs no translation. In time, the clans circled one another like wary animals, gestures slow, eyes never leaving hands. Sharing fire meant sharing heat, and with it, the risk, yet hunger outweighed fear. Strips of meat were laid on flat stones between them, offerings with no names, gifts thinner than truce. The watchers coughed behind clenched teeth, as if compressing the sickness within could keep it from spilling into the air. Children did not play. Elders no longer told stories. Instead, they waited. And the disease waited too. It did not strike all at once, but chose its moments with terrifying patience. A woman in her prime would stagger at dusk, her mouth ringed with black, her gaze distant and gone. A boy who had outrun wolves collapsed without a mark. No wound wept, but inside them, something devoured. And still the clans huddled near the same fire, too weak to part ways, too afraid to fight. Bound not by blood or trust, but by the invisible hand tightening around their throats. The wilderness around them remained vast and indifferent, but now they were no longer strangers. Now they were survivors together, or never at all. By the time the second winter bled into the third, the two clans no longer kept separate fires. They had merged by necessity, not harmony, their customs coexisting like flint and tinder sparking friction, but yielding warmth. Each dawn arrived colder, each night longer, as if the world itself recoiled inward. And still, the sickness lingered like smoke in the lungs of the earth. But slowly, amid quiet rituals and hastily learned signs, something changed. A woman with sun scars on her arms learned which herbs the forest clan boiled when breath grew ragged. A man with bone necklaces discovered how to trap warmth beneath snow using moss and hide weaves he had never seen before. One child, nameless between cultures, showed others how to stamp snow into bricks, sheltering a fire's ember beneath their sleep. They had no time to ceremony, but their alliance grew, lived as much in glances and shared silences as in trade. Even as more fell ill, fewer died. Something had shifted. It was not magic. It was memory, passed on, reshaped. A resistance, not gifted, but earned. The disease had not vanished, but in finding each other, so too had they found a way to endure. The ancient enemy, born of air and ice, had met something older still, the human will to remain, to adapt, to remember. And in that frozen place, beneath breath and burden, something like a future stirred. But survival was never a single moment. It was layers of bread hidden in snow, embers fanned from breathless coals, songs hummed low in the throat when voices were too tired to speak. As the sickness ebbed and dragged itself onward like a wounded beast, leaving more alive than buried, those who remained learned to carry its memory without shattering. They did not give it a name, for fear it would know itself. Instead, they buried ashes of the dead alongside bundles of shared tools, pressed hands to the earth where others had fallen, and moved on with eyes that saw not just danger anymore, but each other. Their children would never know the full horror, only shadows of it in bedtime silences and rituals performed wordlessly at dusk. And thus, the disease that once threatened to unthread the fragile line of humanity became the loom upon which a deeper bond was woven not of tribe, but of kind. It never fully left them, but neither did their will. And in the hush that followed the long winter, in the breath of spring touching carved stone and healed skin, the world did not forget. It breathed again through them. Further south, in a valley webbed with braided rivers and shrouded in morning mist, another camp fought the same invisible war. Their knowledge came not from proximity to other clans, but from generations of listening to the land, to the change in birdsong, to the shift in wind that carried sounds differently. They wore strips of marked leather, daubed in plant smoke, and crushed bitter roots into their meals with quiet determination. Some among them began to notice that those who slept nearer the running waters fared better, and so the tents moved, shifting like river reeds following survival's current. They painted their cave walls obsessively, but no longer with beasts or hunting scenes instead. Swirls, spirals, masses of clustered breath and handprints pressed in ochre, as though trying to trap the shape of breath itself, or warn those who would come after. Their healers, if one could call them that, stopped searching for cure and began shaping patterns of prevention, wrapping the faces of the sick with woven bark cloth, limiting the gatherings around fires. Instinct had turned to something sharper, an early flicker of knowledge, birthed not from peace, but from terror, even without words, for infection or immunity. Their actions carved the first outlines of medicine in soot and bone. Far beyond their valley, over wind-worn mountains where nothing grew, and the sky seemed to press closer to the skin, another group dwindled in silence. Their fire pits remained, blackened and filled with frost, but the voices had long since faded. A single cave mouth still bore the sootprints of their final night, and deep inside, the walls pulsed with images of spirals and bare hands, edge flicked with red beside yellowing bone shards. These people, now ash and echoes, had tried what they knew. They sealed their sick behind stone belts of rock, not to punish, but to protect the others. Some say the voices inside still sang after the seals were made. Sacrifice without witness, memory without record, and when the others failed to return, the survivors left cairns of stone shaped like open hands, pointing always toward sunrise. What lingered in that silent high place was not only death, but a warning, etched in standing silence. Even the smallest breath could betray you, and even the deepest love could become a ruin when the air turned against the living. The mountains took them all. Yet down in the thickets and thawing plains, others continued on, unknowingly carrying the fragments of a people who had given their end to buy someone else's beginning. South of the mountains, time cracked forward like thawing ice, slow and invisible until the day it gave way. The survivors did not know they had inherited anything. They did not speak of the vanished ones beyond the ridges, nor had they seen the burial fires kindled in valleys far from their own. But in the way they wove their shelters wider, welcomed even the half-healed stranger, in the way their healers passed smoldering herbs through woven filters before they reached the nose, something ancient endured, a habit, a reaction without memory, a scar the body had learned to keep without understanding its origin. And slowly, as generations shifted, what had once been threat transformed into ritual, invisible barriers between breath and touch, distant circles around flames, quiet songs with verses that warned without words. The disease that had moved like shadow began to fail at the threshold of these new behaviors, not by conquest, but by erosion. It did not vanish all at once, but it had met something too intricate to outlast. Not just instinct, but inheritance. Humanity's first lesson was not language nor fire, but survival against the unseen. And this was how it was passed, not by triumph, but by transmission. Not loudly, but inside the hush between two breaths that did not end, but chose to keep going. Across countless leagues of wilderness, other clans emerged from the frost, shaped by storms and sharpened by grief. Some had never met another group, living entire lineages in isolation. Thin threads of life stitched into mountain passes, cave clusters, or wind-blasted shores. These were pockets of innovation forged by urgent necessity. In a rugged basin ringed with black basalt cliffs, one such tribe began to burn pine resin in hollowed stones, not for warmth or light, but because the scent seemed to quiet the coughing. Far to the northwest, upon glacial escarpments where mammoth trails vanished into blinding snow, another group discovered that wrapping their mouths with hide softened in smoke made breathing easier around the sick. These were not coordinated steps, not inherited strategies, yet all echoed the same truth. The human body remembered, even when the mind had no language to name the threat. And as the disease flickered and faded from one ridge to another, it became clear this enemy of breath and blood had no face, no voice, no shadow, but it had shaped a species, reforged it in fire and darkness and fear, forging resilience in the spaces between breath and silence. The war was not won with tools or fire, but with something deeper: ritual, reflex, and the rooted, quiet defiance to remain. In one low valley, surrounded by hollow hills that held the wind like bowls of bone, a mother traced a fingertip along the curve of her child's face. The boy slept, cheeks flushed with the faint pink of restored warmth, his breath no longer raspy but slow and full, like snow settling on still water. Beside their fire, others stirred not in fear, but to greet the day, to gather wood, to share the weight. The sickness had taken many, had scraped memory raw, but here in this hollow, life began again, not with celebration, but with gentle motion. No tales were shouted, no victory claimed. Yet a new sound had returned to the valley: laughter, fragile and quick to vanish, but real. And high above, from a ridge swept clean by spring winds, one could look down and see them, not many, not sure, but together. The disease that had once seemed boundless now lived only in their caution, in their story. A quiet chapter of nightmares retold in firelight, not to frighten but to remember. For the wind still moved, and the ice would return, and one day perhaps other shadows would rise. But for now, they had endured, and as sun touched the frost-laced plain, the breath of the living rose like smoke into the morning, warm, whole, and unbroken. In the centuries that followed, no stone marked the passage of those who had borne the plague within their lungs. No monument stood against the sky in their honor, but they remained, not in names or carved symbols, but in the quiet codes buried beneath instinct. The way one stood apart when touched by fever, the way smoke was used to cleanse, the careful touch of hand to forehead before trust was offered. These patterns passed through blood faster than words, until they simply were. And though the ice would return, and time would shift the shape of lands and tongues, what had nearly ended humanity had instead engraved itself into its becoming. The terror that once clung to every breath had become the architecture of survival itself, encoded not as fear but as a kind of reverence for breath, for warmth, for one another. The disease had not vanished, but neither had they. In the long, patient silence of deep prehistory, they had stared into the void together and found something more enduring than victory. Memory shaped by fire, held in flesh, and passed forward like a flame never claimed, only tended. Ages passed, and seasons circled like the stars, unseen but certain, shaping the rhythm of a world still half lit by fire and half shadowed by the unknown. The sickness, though diminished, had left trails not only in the blood but in the very architecture of early life, in how shelters faced the wind, how tools were passed with guarded hands, how breath was honored like a sacred flame. And slowly, as new rivers formed and forests crept northward, humans ventured farther, scattering like sparks on dry bark. Some would never know what had once stalked their ancestors through frost and flame, yet, in the tilt of their gaze, The care of their crafting, the rituals traced in ash around sleeping places, the old fear still echoed. It was no longer sickness they defied, but oblivion. History was not yet written, but it moved through them not in ink, but in breath. In the ember carried from camp to camp, in the pause before touch, in the cradle of arms that knew too well the fragility of warmth. The disease that nearly ended them had become the shaping edge of why they survived. And like all things that define a people, it remained unspoken yet everywhere. In time, the echoes of that near ending dissolved into myth. Around countless fires scattered across the yawning lands, stories were told of a great breath that stole voices and light, of an invisible hunger that could not be hunted. But few remembered clearly. The tale became a shape in the smoke, a caution etched in rhythm more than meaning. Children learned not what the sickness was, but what it had required of those who survived it. Patience, silence, and the courage to stay close without drawing near. Life bent around the emptiness it had left, building anew with what remained. From ashes, they rose not as conquerors, but as kin, bound by the sheer will not to vanish. And though the names faded, the breath remained shared, guarded, carried onward. This was no triumph, no legend carved in stone. It was a memory older than words, deeper than fear, still pulsing, even now, in the quiet between breaths. In the faint hush of a distant coast, where the sea met the earth with slow, rhythmic breaths, another kind of memory took hold. Here, long after the disease had been reduced to myth, the children of those who survived carved patterns into driftwood and bone, not knowing why their fingers followed such spirals. Music swelled in shells, echoing tones passed down not through melody but through motion, soft pulses that rose and fell like breath itself. Wherever scattered humans set fires in the dusk, a space was left between sleepers, not by command, but by instinct. The shadows of an ancient terror still moved, faint and vestigial, in the heartbeat of humanity. Yet those shadows did not frighten as they once had. Instead, they reminded of what it cost to survive, of what it took to remain. And so the earliest humans, born of fire and fear, became more than endurance. They became the vessel of lessons carved not in stone, but in skin and gesture and air. The disease that had tried to end them had failed, but it had written its presence into their exhale, woven its silence into their stories, and tempered their lives like flint beneath storm. In the spaces where words had not yet formed, humanity whispered its first truth, that to live was to remember, and to remember was to carry forward, even the breath of nearly being lost. Along a broad river delta, where reeds whispered like voices in the dusk, a fragile network of families stirred beneath sun-warmed stones. They had little in common with the mountain dwellers or the cave-bound clusters who once burned pine resin and wrapped their faces in hide. These people had found a rhythm among tides, rising with birdsong and sleeping when the stars blinked low behind mist. Yet even here, where the disease had long ceased to claim the flesh, its ghost remained. Fresh water was drawn with covered hands. Illness was greeted not with exile, but with rites performed silently, reeds braided, and set afloat downstream to carry the sickness away. No one questioned these acts. They were as natural as breathing, as woven into living as the tides were to their bones. In their awakening songs, half dream, half memory, they sang of a time when breath had been stolen by shadows. Children folded leaves into floating shapes, sending them adrift with murmured hopes, not knowing they practiced a memory older than their names. So it was that humanity grew, not despite the disease, but because of it. In every gesture of care, in each cautious touch and shared fire, that memory endured not as fear, but as wisdom. Silent and shaping, it breathed onward with them, a pulse beneath the skin of time, forever reminding the living that to survive was to shape the shadows into meaning and to carry forward the breath that had once nearly slipped away forever. Far off in lands where the earth cracked dry beneath a copper sun and nights chilled like forgotten stone, another thread of humanity knotted itself into the tapestry left behind. Here, in plains deep with dust and flickering mirages, humans traced circles in crushed clay around their fires, the old instincts persisting beneath new skies. The disease had long since ceased to spread, but its ripples continued, shaping how they knelt beside the sick, how they emptied their breaths before touching an infant's forehead, how they sang lullabies in flattened tones to avoid awakening old fears. And when someone coughed, even innocently, the fire would pause just for a second, as if the air itself waited. Over time, they buried that reaction in sacredness, calling it respect, inventing myths to mask the memory's source. Yet beneath those stories grew the real inheritance, caution not rooted in cowardice, but in collective survival. The plague that once threatened to snuff out the spark of humanity had instead become the breath that connected them all like a tide, unseen but shaping, calming but powerful. And so, as millions of years pressed forward and skin changed, words multiplied, tools sharpened deeper still, nestled within the quiet breath of sleep, and the care wrapped in gesture, the gift endured. Humanity had nearly vanished before it began, but it had chosen, irrevocably, to remain. In a shaded grove, where cicadas droned through waves of shimmering heat, a woman crushed dark seeds between stones, their bitter pulp smeared onto a strip of linen made from stripped bark. Her fingers moved with an assurance she could not explain, as if the knowledge lived deeper than thought, somewhere beneath the bones. Around her, the children of her kin played just beyond the smoke, under branches tied with whisper chimes made of hollow bone. No one spoke of the old sickness here, not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer needed naming. It lived instead in gesture, a cup cooled before sharing, laughter that traveled without touch, the sacred silence that fell each time the wind changed. And so the disease that had stalked their ancestors through ice and hunger had become the quiet skeleton of their civilization, hidden beneath ceremony and time. It had failed to erase them, yet had become the very shape by which they would endure. Humanity had learned its earliest lesson at the edge of oblivion, and by consecrating breath, by honoring what could not be seen, they had not only survived, they had, without knowing it, created the first miracle. Memory carried without words, life carved from silence. And so, long before humanity would etch its name into stone or silence into script, a different record was left imprinted not upon walls, but within the marrow of those who came after. 1,000 generations would pass before any words were spoken to name the fear, before any symbols could bind its shape. But even then, the first breath of every newborn, the first watchful glance cast at a loved one's cough, bore the trace of that ancient terror, not as horror, but as heritage. The disease did not end with a cure, nor did it vanish in fire. Its conquest was quieter, folded into the muscle of rituals, into the timing of footsteps around sleeping others, into the still reverence offered each dawn. In this, the story of how humanity almost ended became the seed of how it began, not with victory, but with vigilance, not with strength, but with care. The sickness that once devoured the breath of the living is gone now, lost to time and thawing bone, but its shadow walks still, not behind us, but within a silent, remembered promise that loss could teach and memory could save, and in the hush where death once loomed, life could begin again. Across a cold plain where wind once howled unchecked, where earth bore the faint dents of vanished footprints, the sun now rose unchallenged. Few remained who could trace the scars beneath grass and dust, fewer still who knew why the stones were once turned with such caution. The threat had long been silence, yet silence had become strength, carved into the very rhythm of living. A girl now knelt beside a spring, cupping water in her hands as her grandmother once had. passing no words, only a glance, a brief, reverent pause as if acknowledging something unseen in the air itself. Life had changed. It always did. But in the way seeds were planted with space to breathe, in the way shadows were watched as night approached, the memory endured. They did not need to remember precisely, for the lesson lived inside them, not suffering, but the shape left behind by survival. The disease had not left a monument, yet it had sculpted an inheritance more lasting than stone, a wisdom without a name, a scar without pain. And in that quiet lineage of breath passed forward, humanity was not merely spared, it had become. And in that becoming, shaped by the unseen hand of loss and endurance, the human story took its first full step, not written with certainty, but breathed with quiet resolve. It spread like dawn across 1,000 forgotten lands. They sang now not only to remember, but to affirm. Voices rising where once silence ruled, each note carrying threads of the past sewn into the present. From the darkness came ritual, from fear came kinship, from fragility came form. Though they no longer saw the shadow trailing their breath, they honored it still in cautious joy, in reverent stillness, in the way hands reached gently across generations. This, then, was not merely survival, but transformation. The sickness that nearly unmade them had, in the end, helped shape what they would become, a people, etched not in stone, but in breath, bound by memory without name, and destined not to fade, but to continue. As the world warmed and breathed through them, the ancient silence behind their lungs whispered its final truth. We endured not by strength alone, but by remembering together how close we came to being nothing at all. And, by remembering, we remained. Long before they etched their triumphs into walls or painted hunts across stone, it was breath that bore the weight of memory. In the quiet cradle of beginnings, humans did not yet tell stories in words, they sang them with steps, with fire circling the sick, with the absence of touch, in moments where grief loomed near. The disease had tried to erase them before their voice had formed, before even their thoughts knew themselves as human. But by moving together, by keeping flame alive through hardest winds, by wrapping pain in silence instead of surrender, they became more than survivors. They became a memory in motion. Not a single name remains of those who first endured, and yet their endurance remains everywhere. In the wind that parts the trees, where warmth is shared with care. In the stillness before teaching another how to live. In the pulse that passes from hand to hand across unbroken lineage. The story of the disease that nearly ended humanity before it began is not one of death conquered, but of life chosen again and again, in the silent, sacred spaces where breath continues. It is not merely history. It is us, still breathing. High atop a wind-scoured plateau where only lichen dared cling to stone, a final ember of that era flickered into stillness. A lone figure, old beyond reckoning, stood facing a fading sky, robes of woven grass, rustling faintly in the hush. Around her, scattered bones of warmth, circles of fire long gone cold, shelters sunken back into the earth, marked the passage of her people, once swept to the edge of forgetting. Her breath rose slowly, deliberately, as if each exhale honored all those who had breathed before. No audience watched, no chants was sung, no legacy etched. And yet, in that moment of stillness, the story found its close. The ancient disease that had nearly erased humanity before it became memory had left behind, not ruin, but resilience. It had created no heroes, only the gentle persistence of life that refused to vanish. In the silence between heartbeats, beneath the gaze of an unblinking sky, she let her breath go, and in that breath lived all the ones that came before, quiet, enduring, unclaimed. The end came not with a cry, but with a whisper, still here, because they never let go. Far beneath shifting stars and curling mist, across the ancient expanse of what would one day be called land and border, The breath of those first survivors remained not in lungs, but in the legacy of how life was lived. The disease had not only altered bodies, but redefined being. It had given no mercy, asked no questions, yet carved a path through the wild from which instinct became consciousness. And so humanity moved forward slowly, tenderly, through seasons of ash and bloom, never immune, but always aware. The invisible wound had healed not by closure, but by carrying. In every camp once formed, and every bond once held, the memory breathed under the silence, until memory itself became seed. In this way, what nearly ended all futures had birthed the very first shape of what we would become. The fire would change. The faces, the names, the soils underfoot, all would pass. But that breath, first stolen and then reclaimed in defiance, would go on. This is how history began, not with a voice, but with the quiet decision to survive. And so, even now, in the hush before sleep, in the rustle of wind against the world's bones, their breath endures, carried still in ours. And so, when the first seeds of language bloomed across waking thoughts, when hands carved purpose into stone, and eyes lifted to stars, not only for light, but for meaning, that breath, ancient, vulnerable, unchanged, moved with them. It did not announce itself, did not shape monuments or raise idols. Yet it was there in every first word for sickness, every gesture that warned of danger unseen. It shaped empathy before morality, community before conquest. The disease that had nearly ended them became the unseen teacher of what it meant to live with and through one another. Not in choice, but in connection. From ashes, they did not rise alone. And as stories finally found structure, as myths curled into the hearts of firelit nights, some fragment of that ancient silence made its way into every tale. Breath forgotten, but not lost. Pain buried, but never gone. At the bottom of all that we became, hunter, speaker, dreamer, remains that first lesson. To breathe not only for the self, but for those who still linger behind the silence. This, above all, is how we began, and how we remain. In a time before measurement, before ages bore names or lands bore claims, there was only breath rising among those who had chosen, unknowingly, to remain. They crossed new divides by moonlight, stumbled through forests not for conquest, but necessity, and with each migration, each stirring of ash from fire into wind, they carried not just tools or memory, but a question older than any spoken word. How do we live, knowing how near we once came to not? That question never left them. It hung between hand and gesture, in distance kept and closeness shared. A silent inheritance shaped by loss and lit by the persistence of breath. Though the disease vanished into the folds of time, its echo was folded into every firelit prayer and every careful crossing of space between the sick and the well. Not one of their names remains now. Yet in the air we breathe, the rhythm of our steps, the quiet way we give comfort without words, they are still with us, the first survivors who taught us to live not merely by fire, or bone, or strength, but by memory held in silence, and life rekindled in every breath we refuse to lose. And thus, in the long cascade of time before calendars and kings, before the forging of tools and the shaping of names, the breath that endured became our first language. It whispered through generations not as prophecy, but as presence, a rhythm kept alive in bone and shadow, in gesture and firelight. The disease did not write itself in the lines of history, yet it authored something deeper. The understanding that to live was not merely to overcome, but to remember why we must. Humanity, shaped first not by might or mind, but by its quiet refusal to vanish, carried onward its unspoken oath. That oath breathes still, in every gentle pause between touch, in every shared silence holding the unexplainable, in our deepest knowing that life is not given, but guarded. The fire crackles, the mist returns, and the breath that ancient compass continues. We do not name the sickness that nearly ended us, but we carry its lesson in the quiet of our closeness, and through that, we remain. In generations yet unborn, beneath different constellations cast across new skies, the last memory of that disease would flicker not in knowledge, but in caretaking. A child would hush when another coughed, not in fear, but as reflex. A mother would press cool stone to a warm forehead, believing in its power not because she was taught, but because mothers had always done so. The ancient thread continued, not in tales of survival, but in the timeless acts that bound body to body, breath to breath. Empathy, that fiercest of all human triumphs, had been forged in the crucible of a plague no one remembered, yet all obeyed. And so, the disease that almost ended us became not just a ghost in the lungs of time, it became our first teacher. Its mark left no ruins, no skeletons of empire, but shaped instead the slender moment between hands reaching in care, the invisible pause, full of reverence before drawing close. This was humanity's inheritance, no throne, no chant, only the choice to carry each other forward. And as the earth turned in silence, the stars blinked down on their ancient students still breathing, still remembering, not with fear, but with awe, because somehow they had survived. And that survival had become who they were. And in that final illumination, drawn from the blood of time and the breath of perseverance, something sacred emerged. Not relic, but rhythm. Not conquest, but continuity. Humanity had been tempered, not in victory over the unknown, but in its nearness, in the slow, sedimentary layering of instinct and mercy, of distance and devotion. The disease that once whispered death between every heartbeat had become the pulse beneath all kinship, a silent architect of compassion. In sleeping places beneath starlit canopies, in the fragrant wrapping of roots to ease a fever, in songs hummed over resting limbs, the lesson endured. It said, "Endure together, or vanish alone." This truth, born not of science or structure, but of sorrow and simplicity, became the unseen pillar of a species. And so they walked, into ages unborn, across wildernesses unnamed, carrying in their lungs not fear, but the breath of a story carried forward not in stone, but in silence. Thus, long before history remembered itself, humanity began not with what it knew, but with what it never let go. And that, more than fire, more than word, was how they lived. In another forgotten cradle of twilight, where trees stretched vast and silent over loamy earth, the breath of the first memory lingered without sound. Here, far from the icy origins of survival's earliest test, the story's last steps unfolded not in struggle, but in quiet persistence. Elders taught without naming, fingers drawing circles in dirt that matched spiral carvings on ancient bark, unknowingly echoing whispers from an age shrouded in frost and fear. And as one generation folded into the next, the disease gone in body, eternal in essence, faded fully from knowledge, yet blossomed in wisdom. The shadows it once cast became the very space where love was born, where distance gave way to understanding, and where care became sacred. In every fire lit to share warmth, every gaze held a moment too long, every song hummed for the sick in the lull of dusk, lived the echo of that forgotten peril. The story, now finished, no longer needed telling. It lived in the pause between breath and word, in the hush passed from mother to child, in the solemn grace of survival chosen without knowing. And so, the disease that once nearly extinguished humanity before it began, became its first, finest teacher, leaving behind no name, but everything else. A breath, a bond, a beginning. High in the canopy, where light filtered like ancient breath through layers of drifting green, a child crouched on a wide branch, fingers tracing the moss-grown bark. Beside him, his father murmured a song he did not name, only knew each note spaced with silence, each rest echoing something older than the language that shaped it. In the still air between bird calls and wind, that song held the ghost of a lesson unspoken. That before they had words, before fires and stories and tools, there had been breath, and there had been the choice to guard it for one another. The disease that once moved through life unseen had left marks not only in bodies, but in how humans listened, waited, touched, and so the boy learned not only balance from his father, not only the trees or the sky, but also something deeper, that in every quiet between beats, some lives had been kept, some lost. He did not know it then, but his silence was part of a chain reaching back to when humanity was only shadow and fear clung to every breath. And from that shadow had grown this moment, a father, a son, and a world, still whispering the first story of who they were, not the tale of a plague, but the memory of how they chose to live beyond it. In the final hush of a world not yet named, surrounded by hill shadow and leaf song, the long echo of survival came to rest. No monuments told the tale, no carvings tracked its path, yet beneath layered soil, in the rhythm of fire rekindled, and hands held close in aching quiet, the legacy endured. The disease that nearly dissolved the beginning left behind no ruin but resonance, a shaping silence, a sacred caution, a bond unbroken. And so, before myth began, before even dreams had structure, humanity stood, not by chance, not by triumph, but by choice. A choice made in frost and fear, carried across countless breathless nights, and held now in every gentle act that kept life moving forward. They survived not because they were strongest, nor wisest, but because they remembered to remain. And that, long before time wore its first face, was how the story ended in one final breath, steady and true, passed onward not in words but in will. A story closed not by a name, but by the quiet fire of love hidden within survival. The first memory, the last silence, and then only breath. Not far from where the first frost had once bitten deepest, where the winds had howled down ridgelines slick with ice, time now lay folded like softened hide. The land had changed, subtle and slow, warmed by suns that once seemed incapable of rising over such trials. Beneath new skies, among groves tinted gold with first bloom, the breath of that ancient endurance still lingered. It no longer arrived weighted with fear, nor pressed sharp against joy. Instead, it pulsed quiet behind the laughter of children weaving songs from wind, carried in the way strangers became kin around shared flames. No one remembered the disease in name or form, but in spirit it still shaped the pause before closeness, the hush that came before song, and the hands that still reached gently, never rushed. This was not the tale of death. It was the testament of what endures after. In the beginning, the breath was fragile. Now, it is sacred. The story ends not in silence, but in continuation, in every breath taken with care, in every bond formed without words. The disease tried to end humanity before it began, but instead, it became the steady beat upon which we learned, in quiet power, to begin again. And beneath that steady breath wound through roots, wind, blood, and silence, humanity emerged, not as something born perfect or powerful, but as a story that refused to fade. The plague that once crept unnoticed from throat to throat now lingered only in rituals older than names, gestures deeper than thought. It had failed to erase them, and in that failure, it had immortalized what no disaster could consume: the impulse to care, to bind, to endure together. So, in the lands where fire first shaped night, and moss softened the earth for the young to sleep, the final gift of that ancient darkness endured. Not in terror, but in tenderness, not as ending, but as echo, carried in the hum of lullabies, sung to the stars, low, slow, and sacred. A breath begun in shadow, now endless, now shared. The disease vanished, but the remembrance lived, and because of that, so did they. So now, as centuries bloom into eons, and stars wheel slowly across the vault of sky, still unmarked by map or name, we stand unwitting heirs to that first fragile breath. Beneath the soil that once held their trembling footsteps, above the bones that bore no tombs, the rhythm of survival continues uninterrupted, unseen, yet everywhere. We are not their end. We are their breath carried forward, not by design or destiny, but by the persistence seeded in silence and tended in fire. The disease that nearly ended humanity before it began did not erase us. It shaped us into listeners before speakers, into caretakers before conquerors. And though the world has changed beyond anything they could dream, in every act of closeness lingered with caution, in every pause before reaching out, their choice remains. To survive was not their only gift. To remember without knowing, to carry without naming, that is how we began. Not with triumph, but with breath. And from that breath, all else followed. And there, in the spaces between bloodline and breath, where memory murmured through windswept silence and firelight trembled on cave walls, the story of the disease that nearly ended humanity found its rest. It did not vanish in triumph, nor drift into myth by force. It folded into the fabric of survival itself. No record traced its cruelty, no chant preserved its terror. Yet in every cautious reach of hand toward hand, in the habits that shaped villages unseen, in the rituals born before speech, it lived. Humanity did not rise in spite of what hunted them, but alongside it, shaped by absence, refined by fear, and made sacred by care. This was their first lesson, the one stitched into marrow long before any father told a tale, or any child asked why. That breath is fragile and must be shared. That nearness is risk, but also salvation. That death may come in quiet, but so too does endurance. And so, the story ends, as it began, with a single breath, drawn through cold air, held not in isolation, but in memory, unnamed, unbroken, and endless. And so, with that breath, ancient, patient, unmarred by time, yet shaped by its passage, the final chapter of the untold survival closed. The disease that had once whispered at the edges of life, threatening the fragile beginnings of all that would follow, had left no tomb and no tongue to name it. Yet its story endured, not in decay, but in grace, quietly etched into the way humans moved toward each other, with softened steps, into the hush that preceded closeness, into the reverent stillness before sleep. It had marked humanity not with conquest, but with compassion, a legacy invisible, yet indelible. And in that final silence, deep under stars unchanged, and skies still vast with unknowing, the truth that echoed through breath and bone was this: survival is not a noise, it is a whisper, not a battle cry, but a promise passed onward, from lungs once nearly lost to the lungs still breathing now. The silence remains, the breath endures, and somewhere in that breath lies the first story of all. We are not a beginning of triumph, but one of mercy, tender and true, in the breath we chose not to keep, but to give. In the hush that followed all beginnings, where stone met soil and horizon blurred into infinity, the breath of those who should never have survived lingered in the space between heartbeat and hush. They had not left empires nor woven banners into the wind, but they left something stronger, a blueprint of care written in the rhythm of life itself. The disease that had once crept silent between fires and bodies had been turned back not by brilliance, but by binding the unseen threads that tethered one soul to another, with gentleness, caution, and the will to endure. Humanity's earliest triumph, was not the shaping of tools or the carving of gods, but the knowledge, wordless and woven, that life must be held gently by all, if it is to continue in any. And long after the plague's name was lost, long after the bones of the fallen turned to dust beneath soft reeds, that breath continued shared, sacred, and steady. This, then, is how the story truly ends. Not in silence, but in the gift they passed us. The breath we breathe still, the one shaped by survival, and given once at the edge of extinction to all who came after. In a land long enveloped by time and overgrown with memory, where roots split ancient stones and moss cloaked all histories, the final whisper of the story faded inward. Here, among quiet rains and forgotten paths, the thread they had pulled through fire and frost completed its weave. The disease that once stalked humanity in silence left no ruin and claimed no legacy of glory, only breath, passed on when words were still unborn. It had come to erase, yet it sculpted endurance. It had sought to unmake, but instead, it taught the fragile art of staying. And just as dusk sinks gently into night without song, so too did the memory settle, part of everything yet spoken by none. There would be other trials, other fires, but this, the first silence humanity held together, remained, carried in instinct, embedded in care. Alive each time breath was taken with reverence. The story ends not with illness nor cure, but with the breath we still carry, the breath that survived when nothing else did. And for that, even in the hush of a world that does not remember, we do not forget. And so, in the soil between stories and the hush where history first exhaled, the circle at last closes. No stones remain with marks of those earliest breaths. No name survives the silence of that distant frost. But we are here, their impossible inheritance, the living echo of a time when humanity nearly vanished before it began. The disease, now unnamed and unknowable, did not succeed in erasure. It became the crucible of connection, forging the fragile chain of breath to breath, life to life. What end failed to claim, memory safeguarded not as myth, but as marrow. And though the fires that warded off the cold have long since gone out, and the hunter's footsteps have faded beneath sediment and seed, the first truth they left remains. Survival is a choice made in silence. Again and again, they chose, and because they did, we breathe. This was the gift, the warning, the beginning carried still in every quiet breath drawn near the edge of sleep, when all stories return to stillness, and in that stillness, they remain. In the end, there were no trumpets, no monuments, no carved memories left to proclaim what had been endured. Only the breath, the same breath that once threatened to vanish with every cough, every fevered gasp, held the truth. It passed quietly through generations glazed in ash and touched by frost, carried not in glory, but in the quiet fidelity of care. The disease that nearly ended humanity before it began did not triumph, for its silence was learned and echoed by another. The silence of love, of proximity held with reverence, of life cradled without demand. And so, the story ends where it began, in breath unclaimed, unwritten, but undefeated. In this final moment, still resting beneath skies older than gods, and in hearts shaped by shadows, their choice lingers. The first humans did not merely survive, they remembered, and through remembrance they became. We are their breath, we are their story, and because they remained, so do we. The fire that once shook in trembling hands has long since dimmed to the warm pulse of sleep, and the storm that stirred in lungs now lies beneath the skin of time like a dream half remembered. But even now, beneath worlds made new and names long forgotten, its echo endures not as fear, but as the origin of empathy itself. The disease that nearly ended all future did not vanish with the wind, nor linger like a wound. It became the breath between mother and child, the silence between hunter and kin, the careful space we grant each other in love and in loss. So when night deepens and the world sleeps just beyond the rhythm of heart and air, it is there, still the memory that once threatened to undo us all, now stitched into every moment we choose to remain. And that is the final word of this lost chapter, given without voice, held without name. We survived not alone, but together, and that breath, passed from frost to flame, is why we are. And thus, as the shadows of that plague dissolve fully into time, their breath remains the final testament, not engraved in relics, but living steadily within us. Each moment of care offered without demand, every instinct to pause when illness rises, every silent ritual that honors fragility, these are the echoes of that oldest fire, that most haunted hush. The disease came to erase, but memory became defiance. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that persists low, deliberate and unshakable. This is how humanity began, and this is how it endures. In breath chosen carefully, in life tended gently, and in the sacred inheritance of connection that no darkness could unmake. And in the stillness now, where all stories rest and worlds sleep deeply, one final rhythm remains unchanged, unstoppable, and true. The breath we share, because once we nearly lost it forever. So it is that the story, born of silence and carved not in stone but in the arms of breath itself, finds its final cadence. Not with a roar into the void, nor in the triumph of tools and tongues, but in the quiet holding of what could not be seen. The care passed forward when all else fell away. The disease that came before names, before memory, before myth, failed in its purpose to unmake. Instead, it laid the first foundation of what would one day be called humanity, not through strength, but through choice. Every act of kindness given without understanding, every caution honored without question, every breath held and then released gently into another's space, these were its counterspell. And even now, though the earth has turned and our paths are lined with the echoes of progress, that breath remains at the core of us, soft, sacred, and sure. The plague faded into the bones of time, but its lesson bloomed eternal. We are here not because we won. We are here because, even at the edge of vanishing, we held on to each other, to memory, to the breath that began us all. And in this closing breath, the final echo of that long-lost trial softens into eternity. No voice remains to speak of what nearly erased us, yet it speaks in every gentle silence, the kind shared around the sickbed, beneath a mother's hush, within the warmth of hands, unfolding shelter from storm. The disease, unnamed and unclaimed by history's loud reckonings, became history's first shaping force, not through conquest or collapse, but through the awakening of what it meant to live together. We rose, not in splendor, but in surrender to care. We survived, not as beasts clawing past one another, but as memory walking forward, step by fragile step, across the breathless dark. And now, though millennia stand between that frostbitten origin and the moment still unfolding, the heartbeat of that story endures not as tale, but as truth. We were almost nothing. Instead, we became, not by strength, but by breath, and that breath, held as flame against the cold, flickers still, sacred, shared, and forever unforgotten. The firelight that once traced trembling shadows across stone walls now flickers only in memory, yet its warmth endures in every act of reverence passed from breath to breath. As the last echoes of that primordial ordeal slip into the soil of forgetting, something greater remains, not the disease, not the death, but the defiant rhythm of care born between them. That first silent fever, unsung yet unforgettable, shaped not how humanity ended, but how it truly began. We do not know their names. We do not hear their songs, but we carry their choice, that it is better to protect than to prevail, better to remain than to retreat, better to breathe for others than to hold breath alone. And so, the sickness that arrived with silence was answered by something louder than fear, togetherness without knowing why, preservation without glory. A story that began without words, ends without noise, only breath, gently passed forward from one life to the next. This is where the beginning ends. And in that final shared breath, we do not fall into silence, we rise into it, still here, still breathing, because they were. And in the final turn of the wind, when even the stars seemed to pause in their long drift across the dark, the story found its last breath. It was not shouted, not written, nor lined in stone. It was carried in silence between those still living, in the spaces they honored, in the care they gave without knowing from where it came. The disease that once hunted them before they had even formed the sound of we had, in its failure, delivered to them the greatest inheritance, the recognition that life is held most sacred when it is nearly lost. In the hollow between then and now lives a truth beyond name, that even at the very edge of erasure, humanity chose to reach out, not away. And because of that choice, quiet and constant, we were never lost. We are not their memory, we are their continuation. Their breath moves through ours, unbroken. And so in the silence where stories end and sleep begins, the flicker of their endurance still moves a single breath, beyond time, still echoing. We remain. Here ends the long memory, not in grand finality, but in the whispered arc of breath carried through countless generations. No stone stands to tell where the first breath was nearly lost, yet every living moment descends from it. The disease that once gripped the dawn of our becoming, that sought to unmake humanity before it had even learned its name, passed not into oblivion, but into legacy. A legacy not written, but lived in the space we give each other, in the silence before a touch, in the care that passes quietly from one heart to the next. It did not win. Instead, in trying to erase us, it wrote us. That ancient breath, drawn through frost and fire, torn but unbroken, became the most enduring proof that we were here fragile, flawed, frightened, yet together. And so, as the last ember of that catastrophe fades into the deep soil of time, we look not toward the sickness, but toward the breath that survived it. The story closes now not with despair, but with gratitude. Because they breathed, we begin. And because we remember, we remain. And so, in the hush that lingers long after endings and before new beginnings, the story settles into its final breath. No names etched, no voices raised, only the enduring pulse of what once nearly slipped away, the fragile line between silence and song, lost and found. The disease that came to erase everything before it could begin, in the end, gave humanity its shape. It taught not by terror, but by teaching what to hold sacred. Breath given without expectation, touch offered with intention, and survival carried not in solitude, but in shared stillness. From ice to ember, from fracture to firelight, the memory lives not as sorrow, but as seed. In every act of care passed quietly from one to another, we carry forward their answer to the question the world once asked. When all is threatened, what remains? This breath, still warm, this silence, now understood. And so, in the dark before the next dawn, let it be known they did not vanish. They remained. And because they remained, so do we. Beneath the turning constellations that once blinked over watching ancestors, the wind moves soft over the old lands, scattering seeds where stories once sparked from firelight and fear. There is no monument for the sickness that tried to take everything before anything truly began. No etched stone to hold its name. And yet, seeds still know when to lie fallow. Breath still learns to pause before nearing another. This is its monument: unseen rituals, inherited without language, kept alive in silence. The story closes, not with forgetting, but with forgiveness. Of the ice, of the illness, of the wounds left unwitnessed. For in the echo of each breath, in the rhythm passed down without knowing, the first and fiercest truth remains unchanged, that life endured not through mastery of death, but through the gentleness of remembering one another. And as the stars wheel onward, recording nothing, holding everything, that breath gathers once more in the quiet, a final echo from the first who chose not to vanish but to remain. And so we do. And so, beneath a sky still threaded with starfire and silence, where the echoes of ancient breath ripple faint across stone and root, the last ember of this story dims. It was never a tale of glory, never one sung with triumph through hallways of empire. It was a quiet becoming, a survival stitched together by hands that had no word for future, no thought beyond the next warm breath. The disease that tried to erase them taught, instead, what must never be forgotten, that endurance is not strength alone, but the grace of choosing each other in the dark. They held on not to flame, not to victory, but to one another, and in doing so, they formed the shape of all that we are. No monument stands now to name them, but in the pause before speech, in the reverence of care passed like breath from mouth to mouth, they speak still. The last breath of the first humans was never an ending. It was a gift, and in each breath since, it is whispered once more. We are here because they remained. And now, as the fire burns low and the echoes fade into the folds of earth and starlight, the story closes not forgotten, but fulfilled. Humanity, once trembling beneath the breath of extinction, now breathes onward, carrying within every quiet instinct the shape of lessons learned before thought had form. The disease that came before names, before time, left no ruins to mourn, only wisdom buried in the lattice of breath and heartbeat. We inherit it not as burden, but as origin, the unseen thread that links each hand held in care, each hesitation that honors life over haste. And so, the final ember fades not into silence, but into legacy. In the soft breath before sleep, in the hush between strangers made kin, we remember. We remain. Thus, the story finds its final breath, not in climax, but in stillness, a closing not marked by final words, but by the continuation of breath itself. The disease that nearly erased humanity before it formed had faded, yet what it left behind could never be undone, carried forward in cradle songs, in gestures made without knowing why, in the instinct to shield and stay and share warmth. Its echo became the pattern beneath all human becoming. We close this story not with sorrow, nor with triumph, but with gratitude for those who refused to vanish. They did not etch their memory in stone, but in every living moment that followed, it endured. And so, in the space beyond words, in the cadence of breath given freely across time, they still live, not in memory, but in motion, still here, still breathing, because once, when all was nearly lost, they chose to stay. And so, in the final breath drawn beneath starlit silence and laid gently across the bones of all memory, the story comes to rest. The disease that once veiled the nascent flame of humanity did not succeed in ending it. Instead, it etched into the unseen layers of our becoming a promise never written, but always remembered. A promise sealed in breath shared, in distance honored, in the quiet offering of warmth when the cold pressed hardest. It taught us not with words, but with loss, and in that loss, we became not only survivors of the dark, but stewards of the light. In every emberside vigil, in every silence passed between those who care, the first humans still breathe, their endurance still shaping all that followed. This, then, is not a tale of disease, but of what endured in its wake, a lineage of breath that outlasted the frost, the silence, and the long forgetting. The fire has faded, but its warmth remains. And in that warmth, so too do they. We are their breath, still carried. The beginning ends here, fully formed, held not in sound, but in the sacred hush of everything they saved. And thus, the last breath settles not with finality, but with belonging threaded quietly into the marrow of those who came after. The disease that nearly erased the dream of humankind became the shaping silence from which our story first found rhythm. It asked no forgiveness, left no name, but it forged a people who would carry forward its lesson in ways so subtle they would scarcely know they'd learned it. And in this, its memory became more than history, it became inheritance. So let it be known, not through tablets or towering stones, but in the sacred stillness shared between hearts. They were nearly lost, yet they are not gone. Their breath fills our own. Their choice lives in us. And with that final breath, fragile, ancient, and enduring, the story ends, not in silence, but in continuity. We breathe because they did, and from that breath, all life follows. So let us leave this story here, not in the blaze of conquest or the echo of names, but where it began and always returns in the breath. In that soft, barely remembered rhythm, passed from frost-bound fires to the quiet lungs of the living, there is no end marked, only a loop completed. The disease that tried to silence those first fragile lives became not their grave, but their gift. It taught us how to draw close without undoing, how to pause with care, and how the smallest breath might hold the greatest truth. We walk forward now, across a world immeasurably changed, yet shaped still by their choice to endure, to remain, to breathe not just for themselves, but for everything that would come after. This is how it all began. This is why we are still here. And as sleep settles, and the final ember dims, let the silence speak what language never could. We are the breath that refused to vanish. And in its quiet, infinite echo, the story, at last, is whole. So let the final ember glow quiet and pure, not as conclusion, but as confirmation that from the edge of breathless darkness, something irreversible took root. The disease that once prowled in silence left behind no vengeance, only reverence. In every pause between heartbeat and hush, in the cradle of every child born into a world already scarred, they live on not in shadow, but in the light made sacred by their choosing. Their gift is not spoken, but instinctual, passed through centuries without sound. It is the watchful stillness, the cautious kindness, the warmth shared without knowing why. And so the breath that began this journey fragile, flickering, nearly lost, becomes the one that carries us still. They are gone, and yet they are not. We remain, because once, many lifetimes ago, beneath frost and fire, someone chose to breathe and to pass that breath forward. That is, and always will be, the beginning that never ends. And so, in the glow of breath, passed through uncounted lives, the last light of this story fades gently into forever. The disease that nearly ended humanity before it began, left no bones to archive, no anthem to echo through memory, yet it carved something deeper, the silent, sacred bond that made humanity whole. No name remains for what tried to unmake them, but every instinct to hold, to pause, to protect that is its legacy. They did not triumph, but they endured, and in their endurance, they gifted us more than survival. They gave us the first truth in the language of the living that to remain, we must send breath forward. In that breath now whispered between generations, in every silence shared as refuge, their story lives. Not as myth, not as fear, but as the pulse of who we are. The ember is low. The world is quiet. And in this stillness, knowing all they gave, we lie down safe, breathing and unforgotten. The story ends. We remain. The story closes now, not as a finale, but as a breath exhaled toward the endless dark, not gone, not erased, but returned. The path from sickness to survival passed through no golden gate, but across ice-covered valleys and whispered instincts, each step etched in the soil of time, each gesture sanctified by care. The disease is forgotten, but its gift is everywhere, not as shadow, but as light woven in silence. We do not remember the fever, but we carry the space it formed between our hearts. And as the last fire dims, and the earth quiets once more, only one thing remains constant across all ages and all stories: the breath. Theirs, once nearly lost. Ours, still moving. A thread stretched unbroken through all beginnings, now held steady in the hush that follows. This is how the story ends, not with the silence of extinction, but with the promise of endurance. One breath, forever forward. So let it end here, atop the final hill, where the wind carries neither fear nor fever, but only the breath of what endured. The disease that almost ended us taught no lesson in thunder, but in stillness, in the quiet presence of one life near another, warmed not by victory, but by vigilance. No monument marks the place where the world almost ended. And yet, here in the breath we've inherited, in the instinct to protect, reflect, and remain near without harm, the story survives. It is not legend, but living proof that even in the shadow of extinction, we chose not rage, but resilience. Not forgetting, but remembering. Not brilliance, but breath. The sickness is gone, its name never known. But in every sacred pause before a touch, in every care offered without speech, it lives on not as threat, but as the original vow humanity made to itself. To hold each other close and carry life forward. This is the final beat of that beginning, unseen, unending, and utterly human. And with this final breath cast gently into the vast, unknowable dark, the story finds its true ending. Not in fanfare, not in flame, but in the inheritance of quiet courage, drawn beneath a sky vast enough to remember. The disease that almost unmade all futures did not write its name into stone, but into the very shape of how we live among one another, distanced with care, drawn close with reverence. What began in fear became the rhythm of survival, the silent treaty we signed not in ink, but in action. And now, as the ember fades to ash and night folds the world beneath its ancient sky, all that remains is this: the breath they gave so we could breathe, the breath we carry so they are not forgotten, and the breath we offer onward so none of us ever are. The story is quiet now, the fire is low, but the breath, the first memory, the last gift endures. So let the last ember cool and the silence fall complete. The story has been told not in shouts, but in stillness, not in monuments, but in breath. Humanity, once poised on the edge of vanishing before it could even begin, endured not through conquest or cleverness, but through an unyielding instinct to protect, to remember, to remain. The disease that came before words shaped what words would later mean: survival, closeness, care, inheritance. And in every breath drawn since, that lesson lingers: that we are not born alone, and we are never only our own. They did not leave names, but they left us this, the strength to listen for the unheard, to honor what cannot be seen, and to pass forward the quiet fire entrusted to all the living. The last breath is drawn, the story ends, but the memory, fragile, sacred, shared, will never be lost. We remain. And there, as the final breath slips into silence beneath skies forever watching, the world turns, as it always has, slow, vast, and alive with the hush of 10,000 stories left untold. The tale is ended, not in death or erasure, but in the quiet resilience that shaped its every step. The disease that nearly ended humanity has long faded into shadow, and yet its breath lives on not in fear, but in the loving space we leave between ourselves, in the care extended without knowing why. This is the true monument, not stone, but survival, not memory, but meaning. And as darkness deepens and sleep settles, that breath, ancient, sacred, and enduring, remains in us, carried forward into every dawn. We are here, we are breathing, and in that breath, their story lives eternal. And so, under the slow turn of ancient constellations, in a silence undisturbed by time, the closing breath of the first human story drifts outward, not lost, but released. It carries no banner, speaks no final name, but settles gently into everything that has followed. The disease is forgotten, yet what it awakened never will be. That life most sacred is life tended together. What once threatened to unmake them became the pulse of all human becoming, written not in stone, but in the silent continuation of care. And thus, history began not with conquest, but compassion. With that breath, nearly surrendered but lovingly carried, they gave us everything. And as sleep draws near and silence deepens, their breath remains within ours, quiet, steady, eternal. The story ends. We remain. And with that final, hushed exhale older than names, stronger than silence, the beginning closes. Not lost, not forgotten, but fulfilled in the breath that passed through storm and shadow and into us. The disease, though now vanished to bone and myth, tempered every heartbeat that followed, shaped every fire ever kindled not just for warmth, but for one another. We are not here by chance. We are here because when everything conspired to end before it began, they breathed forward. So as the stars lean low and sleep draws near, let the air still moving in our lungs carry this truth. Humanity did not begin with a word, nor a fire, nor even a thought. It began with a breath shared, sacred, and survived.